The fire had consumed everything. Jacob Miller stood at the edge of what had been their homestead, his wife Catherine beside him, their 5-year-old daughter Rose clinging to her mother's skirt. 3 days of work, 6 years of building a life, all reduced to ash and twisted metal in a single afternoon when a lightning strike had ignited their roof during the dry season. They'd escaped with their lives and little else. Jacob's rifle, the clothes on their backs, a cast-iron pot Catherine had grabbed, a few tools from the barn that had somehow survived. Their small herd of cattle had scattered during the fire, likely taken by opportunistic neighbors before Jacob could round them up. Their winter supplies, their seed for spring planting, Catherine's sewing machine that had been her mother's, all gone. "We can rebuild," Catherine said quietly, though her voice trembled. Jacob wanted to believe it, but their savings had been hidden in the house, $70 in a tin box, now melted slag somewhere in the ruins. They had perhaps $3 in coins in his pocket. Winter was 6 weeks away. The nearest town was 40 miles distant, and they had no wagon, no horses. "Papa?" Rose's small voice cut through his despair. "I'm cold." It was only October, but the New Mexico nights were already turning bitter. They needed shelter, and they needed it now. Jacob made his decision. "We head into the hills. I know these lands. There are caves in the red rock country to the north. We shelter there while we figure out what comes next." They walked for 2 days, following game trails Jacob knew from hunting expeditions. Catherine carried Rose when the child's legs gave out, though Catherine herself was exhausted beyond measure. Jacob scouted ahead, his rifle ready, though they saw no game worth shooting with their limited ammunition. On the 3rd day, as the sun climbed toward noon and Rose whimpered with hunger and thirst, they found it. The cave entrance was hidden behind a stand of twisted juniper trees, a dark mouth in the sandstone cliff that looked unpromising at first. But when Jacob ventured inside with a torch made from a juniper branch, the passage opened into something that made him stop in wonder. The main chamber was immense, perhaps 60 feet across and 40 feet high at its dome. But what caught his attention was the sound of running water echoing from deeper within. Following the sound, torch held high, he found a natural spring emerging from the rock wall, feeding a pool perhaps 30 feet across. And in that pool, visible in the torchlight, were fish, small pale creatures that had adapted to the cave's darkness. Jacob knelt by the pool and tasted the water. Cold, clean, sweet. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Catherine, bring Rose. We've found our shelter." That first night, they huddled together near the entrance, a small fire providing warmth and light. Jacob had managed to catch one of the cave fish using his hands and incredible patience, a desperate, fumbling attempt that had somehow worked. Catherine roasted it on a flat stone, and they split it 3 ways. It wasn't enough to fill their bellies, but it was hope. "We can survive here," Jacob said, pulling his family close. "We have water, we have fish, we have shelter from the weather. We'll make this work until spring, then figure out our next move." The first week was a blur of desperate activity. Jacob used their limited supplies to create basic necessities. He fashioned fishing hooks from 2 nails he'd salvaged from the homestead ruins, bending them carefully over their fire. For fishing line, Catherine contributed thread from the small sewing kit she'd managed to grab. It wasn't ideal, but it would work. Teaching himself to fish the cave pool required patience Jacob didn't feel he had. The fish were cautious, adapted to an environment where food was scarce. He tried various baits, scraps of leather, insects he found under rocks, bits of the wild plants Catherine had identified as edible, Eventually, he discovered the fish would take small pieces of their own kind, so he saved scraps from each catch to use as bait for the next. Rose watched her father fish with wide, serious eyes. At 5, she was old enough to understand their situation was grave, young enough to still find wonder in the cave's echoing spaces and the strange, pale fish. Jacob made her a small fishing rod from a thin juniper branch, showed her how to hold it steady, how to feel for the subtle tug that meant a fish was investigating. The day Rose caught her first fish, a tiny thing barely 4 inches long, she shrieked with delight, and the sound echoed through the cave like music. Catherine cried, and Jacob had to turn away to hide his own tears. They were surviving, actually surviving. Catherine took charge of their food preparation with the same efficient competence she'd brought to running their homestead. Their cast iron pot became precious beyond measure. She used it sparingly, preferring to cook fish on heated flat stones she'd arranged near their fire. She discovered that different stones held heat differently. The darker sandstone pieces stayed hot longer, while lighter-colored rocks heated quickly but cooled fast. She developed a system for cooking their daily catch. The fish would be gutted immediately. Jacob had made her a small knife from a piece of flint he'd carefully shaped, and she used this for the delicate work of cleaning fish, saving her steel knife for tougher jobs. The fish guts went into a small pit she'd designated for waste, far from both their living area and the pool. For cooking, she'd heat several stones in the fire, then use 2 sticks as tongs to move them to a clear area. The fish would go directly onto the hot stone, where it would sizzle and cook in minutes. The smell that filled the cave during cooking became a comfort. It meant food, safety, family. She saved the fish oil religiously, collecting every drop that dripped off during cooking in a small tin cup Jacob had bent back into shape from the homestead ruins. This oil became multi-purpose: fuel for the lamps they'd eventually create, waterproofing for leather, even a base for the crude soap she'd make later by mixing it with ash and heating the combination. The bathroom situation required immediate attention and careful planning. On their second day, Jacob and Catherine had scouted the cave thoroughly, finding a natural alcove perhaps 100 feet from their main living area and well away from the pool. This became their designated latrine area. Jacob dug a pit using a flat piece of sandstone as a crude shovel, hard, exhausting work that left his hands raw. The pit was perhaps 2 feet deep and a foot across. After each use, they'd cover the waste with a mixture of dirt and ash from their fire, which helped control odors. Catherine rigged a privacy curtain using their one spare blanket hung on a rope Jacob had strung between 2 rock protrusions. Every 3 weeks, Jacob would fill the old pit completely and dig a new one adjacent to it. It was unpleasant work, but necessary. Catherine established strict rules about hand washing after using the latrine. They'd scrub with sand and water, then rinse thoroughly. She was terrified of illness in this isolated place where they had no medical supplies and no help. Water management became a science. The pool was their source for everything, but Catherine was fanatical about never contaminating it. She established zones. An area upstream from where the fish congregated was designated for collecting drinking and cooking water. A different area, downstream, was where they could collect water for washing. Used water was always disposed of in the far corner of the cave where it would seep into cracks in the floor, never near the pool. For bathing, they developed a weekly routine. Catherine would heat water in their pot over the fire, a process that took considerable time and fuel. They'd pour the heated water into a shallow natural depression in the rock floor that Catherine had found and scoured clean. Rose bathed first in the clean water, then Catherine, then Jacob, using the same water. The entire process was done section by section. Wash hair, rinse, wash arms, rinse, conserving every drop. The used water would then be saved for washing clothes or, if too dirty, poured into their disposal area. Clothing care was Catherine's domain and a constant battle. She'd wash their garments when they could spare the water and fuel, using heated water and sand as an abrasive to remove dirt and body oils. She'd scrub each piece thoroughly, rinse it in clean water, then hang it on ropes Jacob had strung across the cave using cord they'd carefully rationed from their supplies. The cave's constant temperature, cool but not cold, and low humidity meant clothes dried slowly but thoroughly. Catherine learned to plan their washing around their work schedule, ensuring they always had dry clothes available. She mended constantly, using thread she'd carefully unpicked from garments that were beyond repair, later supplementing this with thread she made from plant fibers and fish sinew. As weeks passed and October turned to November, Jacob realized they'd be staying through winter. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. They were alive, they were together, and they were developing the skills to survive. He began planning a more permanent shelter. The cave had a large alcove set back from the main chamber, roughly 15 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a floor that was elevated above the main cave level, keeping it dry. It was perfect for building. "We're going to build a cabin," he announced one evening as they sat around their fire. "Right there in that alcove, proper walls, a roof, a real home inside the cave." Catherine looked at him, hope and doubt warring in her expression. "Can we do it?" "We have to try." The work was monumental. Every day, Jacob would venture out, leaving Catherine and Rose with strict instructions to stay in the cave. He'd search for dead trees, juniper and pinon primarily, whatever he could find that was solid enough to use as building material. He had no saw, just his knife and a small hatchet that had survived the fire, so he looked for trees that were already down, that he could drag back to the cave. Some logs were small enough that he could manage alone. Larger ones required different thinking. He'd cut them into sections using his hatchet, a process that could take hours for a single tree. His hands developed thick calluses, then blisters beneath the calluses that would break and bleed before forming new calluses. Catherine helped when she could, watching Rose while hauling smaller branches and preparing the building site. Rose contributed too, gathering small sticks for kindling, straightening bent nails Jacob had salvaged, sorting stones that might be useful. Jacob built the cabin frame using notched log construction, a technique he'd learned from his father years ago. Each log had to be carefully shaped, semicircular grooves carved into the top and bottom to fit with the logs above and below. Without proper tools, he used his hatchet and knife, working each log for hours to get the fit right. He used wooden pegs for joining, whittling them from hardwood scraps, drilling holes using a nail he'd heat in the fire and then pound through the wood. The pegs were driven tight, holding the structure together without metal fasteners they couldn't spare. For chinking the gaps between logs, Jacob experimented with different materials before settling on a mixture Catherine developed. Clay from the pond's edge, finely shredded dried grass, and rendered fat from the occasional rabbits Jacob caught in snares he'd set outside. The mixture was messy to work with and smelled terrible while wet, but it dried hard and kept out drafts remarkably well. The walls rose slowly over November. Rose would watch her father work, would bring him water, would sit beside him and ask endless questions about what he was doing and why. Jacob answered patiently, teaching her, realizing these were lessons she might need someday. The roof was their greatest challenge. Jacob had no proper roofing materials, so he improvised. He used bark stripped from dead trees, laying it in overlapping layers. Over this, he placed smaller branches woven together in a lattice pattern. On top of that, their canvas tarp, their most precious piece of fabric, secured with rocks and wooden pegs. The roof pitched steeply, so any moisture from the cave ceiling above would run off rather than pool and eventually leak through. Inside the cabin, Jacob built sleeping platforms using a framework of smaller branches lashed together with strips of leather he'd cut from his worn boots and belt. On top of this frame, Catherine laid woven mats she'd made from dried grasses, then their remaining blankets. Getting off the ground made an enormous difference in warmth and comfort, and the first night they slept in their new beds, Catherine actually smiled. The first real smile Jacob had seen since the fire. Jacob constructed a hearth just inside the cabin door using carefully selected flat stones, positioning it so the smoke would draw toward a gap he'd left near the roofline, which in turn would carry smoke toward the cave's natural chimney. The first time he lit a fire in that hearth, and the smoke actually drew upward instead of choking them, he felt a surge of pride that warmed him as much as the flames. Furniture came next, built from scraps and necessity. A table from a large, flat piece of sandstone balanced on stacked rocks. Shelves made from smaller pieces of wood, lashed together with leather thongs and suspended from the walls. 3 stools, crude, ungainly things that wobbled alarmingly, but held their weight. A separate work surface for Catherine where she could prepare food. Storage boxes built from thin pieces of bark bent and tied together. Daily life developed its own rhythms. Jacob would wake first, usually before dawn, and build up the fire from the banked coals he'd preserved overnight. This was a critical skill. Starting a fire from scratch wasted their limited supply of flint, steel, and char cloth, so keeping coals alive through the night became a nightly ritual he performed with almost religious care. While the fire grew, he'd start water heating for their morning meal. Catherine would wake next, then Rose, and together they'd prepare breakfast, usually fish soup made from yesterday's bones and scraps, thickened with whatever Catherine had managed to gather during her own forays outside. Wild onions when she could find them, yucca root ground into a paste, acorns she'd processed through the lengthy leaching process that removed their bitter tannins. After breakfast came fishing, their most critical daily task. Jacob would take the primary position at the pool with 2 lines set, while Catherine would work a 3rd line from a different angle. Rose had her own small line, and while she rarely caught anything significant, the practice was valuable and kept her engaged. Jacob had become remarkably skilled at fishing the cave pool. He'd learned the fish's patterns. They were most active in early morning and late evening, less so during midday. They preferred to feed near the spring's inflow where the current was strongest. They responded differently to different baits. Fresh fish guts were best, but they'd also take small insects or even tiny pieces of the cave fish themselves. He'd made multiple hooks from various materials, nails bent and shaped, fish bones carefully carved and sharpened, even a piece of brass wire he'd found at the homestead site when he'd returned to salvage what he could. With several lines working simultaneously, they could usually count on catching 3 to 5 fish per day, enough to sustain them without depleting the pool's population. Catherine had developed remarkable skill at cleaning the fish with minimal waste. She'd use her flint knife to make a precise cut along the belly, remove the guts in one smooth motion, scrape away the scales, and have the fish ready for cooking in under a minute. The guts went into their designated bait container. The scales she saved in a separate container, planning to use them eventually as fertilizer if they ever tried to grow plants. The bones from cooked fish were boiled repeatedly to extract every bit of nutrition, then dried and saved. They became tools, needles, awls, scrapers. Cooking had become Catherine's art form. She'd learned to vary their fish preparation to combat the monotony of eating the same food daily. Fish roasted plain on the hot stones, seasoned with wild herbs she'd gathered. Mint, a sage-like plant, even a kind of wild oregano she'd found growing in the valley below their cave. Fish boiled in their precious pot with onions and roots, creating a soup that was thin but nourishing. Fish smoked over the fire using green juniper wood, which gave it a distinctive flavor and helped preserve it for several extra days, crucial for days when fishing was poor or weather prevented them from fishing at all. Fish dried in the cave's constant air currents, creating a jerky-like food they stored in a basket for emergencies. Catherine had even created a crude oven using flat rocks stacked to create a small enclosed chamber beside their main fire. By heating the rocks thoroughly and placing food inside on smaller stones, she could bake rather than just roast or boil. She'd learned to make acorn cakes. The acorns required days of processing, but the resulting flour could be mixed with fish oil and water, formed into cakes, and baked in her rock oven, creating a bread-like food that added precious variety to their diet. Midday was for lessons and work. Catherine taught Rose letters and numbers using a charred stick on smooth cave walls. They'd practice reading from their saved Bible and Farmer's Almanac. Rose proved quick, writing carefully, reading aloud in her clear voice. These lessons maintained normalcy, reminding them they were civilized people. While Catherine taught, Jacob worked on maintenance and tool-making. He'd made needles from fish bones, knives from flint, even a basic loom with wooden frame and leather cords. Catherine used it to weave dried grass and rabbit fur into rough cloth for blankets and patches. Afternoons were for gathering. Jacob would venture out collecting firewood, dead juniper and piñon primarily. He'd check his snare line, carefully placed to catch rabbits and squirrels. Success was irregular, but each catch meant meat, fur, bones, and sinew. Catherine would gather when weather permitted, teaching Rose to identify edible plants, prickly pear pads, yucca fruit and flowers, wild onions, pine nuts, wild spinach near water sources. Each new edible plant was a victory. Catherine taught Rose to test new foods carefully and harvest sustainably. Evenings were for preparation and precious family time. Catherine would prepare their main meal, usually fish with whatever vegetables or supplements she'd gathered, portioned carefully to ensure Rose got the largest share. The child was growing and needed the nutrition more than her parents did, though both Catherine and Jacob were getting leaner as winter progressed. After dinner, there was always work to be done, mending clothes, maintaining tools, preparing for the next day. Catherine would sew by firelight, her needles moving with practiced efficiency. Jacob would sharpen knives, check fishing lines for wear, repair anything that needed attention. But before bed, they'd spend time together as a family, and these moments were the heart of their day. Jacob would tell stories by firelight, tales from his own childhood, stories his father had told him, adventures he invented that made Rose's eyes grow wide with wonder. Catherine would teach Rose songs, or they'd sing together, their voices echoing softly in the cave's vastness. These evening moments were precious to all of them, when the desperate struggle to survive faded into the background and they were just a family, safe and together, grateful for another day. Hygiene required constant vigilance. Jacob had designated a flat rock as their washing station, where they'd scrub their hands with sand and water before eating and after using the latrine. Catherine had made a crude soap by mixing ash from their fire with rendered fat. The resulting substance stung the skin, but cleaned effectively. She insisted they wash their hands frequently, wash their faces daily, maintain cleanliness as best they could. For bathing, they'd developed their weekly system, but Catherine also insisted on daily face and hand washing. She'd made them all wash their feet before bed each night, a practice that seemed almost luxurious given their circumstances, but one she insisted on as a matter of dignity and health. Dental care was simple, but crucial. Catherine had them rinse their mouths thoroughly after eating, and twice a week she'd have them chew on the frayed end of a green juniper twig, using it to scrub their teeth and gums. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing, and she'd seen too many people lose teeth to neglect to let that happen to her family. As November gave way to December and true winter set in, the cave proved its worth. Outside, temperatures plummeted and snow fell in the surrounding mountains. But inside the cave, the temperature remained relatively constant, cool but not freezing, thanks to the Earth's insulation. Inside their cabin, with the fire burning and all their carefully constructed barriers in place, it was genuinely comfortable. They'd gone from having everything to having almost nothing to building something new from raw determination. The cabin wasn't the homestead they'd lost, but it was solid, it was warm, and it was theirs. They'd built it with their own hands, as a family. Rose thrived in ways that surprised both her parents. At 5, she'd become remarkably capable. She could fish with near-adult patience, could identify a dozen edible plants, could tend the fire safely, could help prepare meals. She was learning skills most children would never need, but she approached them with enthusiasm rather than fear. The crisis came in mid-January when Jacob fell ill. It started as a cough, then fever, then chills that left him shaking despite being wrapped in blankets beside the fire. He tried to hide it at first, tried to keep working, but eventually he collapsed while checking his snare line and had to be helped back to the cabin by Catherine. For 4 days, Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness. Catherine managed everything alone, caught fish, cooked meals, maintained the fire, cared for Rose, brought cool water to press against Jacob's burning forehead. Rose helped as best she could, her small face serious with worry, following her mother's instructions precisely. Catherine was terrified. If Jacob died, how would she and Rose survive? She couldn't hunt as well, couldn't gather wood as efficiently, couldn't defend them if danger came. She prayed desperately, bargained with God, promised anything if he'd just let her husband live. On the 5th day, Jacob's fever broke. He woke weak as a newborn, but lucid, his eyes focusing on Catherine's tear-streaked face with recognition and love. Rose threw herself on him crying, and he held his daughter with trembling arms. "I'm okay," he whispered. "I'm okay." Catherine made him soup from their best fish and the last of their wild onions, feeding him slowly, watching his color return gradually over the following days. The scare had been profound, a reminder of how fragile their situation remained, but they'd survived it. Catherine had kept them going alone, had proved she could do it if she had to. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. By February, Jacob had recovered fully, and signs of spring were beginning to show. The worst of winter was behind them. They'd survived months in the cave, had built a home, had developed skills and systems that worked. Jacob began scouting farther from the cave, exploring the surrounding country. He found evidence of an old trail, found a valley with good grazing that wild horses used, found a creek that would run strong with snowmelt. The discoveries told him they weren't as isolated as he'd thought. One evening, as they sat around their fire, Rose asked, "Papa, will we always live in the cave?" Jacob looked at his wife, saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart. We've built a life here. We're safe. We have food and water." "But," Catherine prompted gently. "But Rose needs more than this cave can give her," Jacob admitted. "She needs school, needs other children, needs a future beyond fishing and gathering." "So what do we do?" Catherine asked. Jacob thought carefully before answering. "We stay through winter, build up our strength and supplies. Come spring, I'll make trips to find work. There are ranches in this territory, towns that need skilled workers. We'll save money, make plans, eventually build something permanent, but we'll do it right this time, carefully, without rushing." "And the cave?" Rose asked. "The cave will always be here," Jacob said, pulling his daughter close. "It saved our lives. We'll never forget it." That night, after Rose had fallen asleep, Jacob and Catherine sat by the fire talking in low voices about their future. They had perhaps $5 saved from what they'd started with. They had skills they'd developed through desperate necessity. They had a family that had survived something that should have destroyed them. "We're stronger now," Catherine said quietly. "The fire took everything, but it didn't take us. We rebuilt from nothing. Whatever comes next, we can handle it." Jacob pulled his wife close, grateful beyond words for her strength, her competence, her unwavering support. "Yes, we can handle it. Together." Outside, winter wind howled across the plateau. But inside the cave, inside their little cabin, the Miller family was safe and warm and whole. They'd been cast into desperate circumstances, had faced starvation and exposure and illness, but they'd survived. More than survived. They'd built a life from stone and water and unwavering determination. Whatever the future held, they would face it as they'd faced everything else. Together, as a family, drawing strength from one another. The cave had been their shelter when they'd had nothing else. It had become their classroom, their proving ground, their home, and they would carry this time with them always, would remember that they'd built something from nothing and survived when survival seemed impossible. The fire crackled softly, the pool's gentle ripples provided constant background music, and the Miller family slept peacefully in their cave home, grateful for the present and cautiously hopeful for the future.